Welcome back. So I had the pleasure of introducing Norman for a second time today, and I forgive me, Norman, but I'm going to tell people not like what your titles are, but just a little bit of what I've experienced working with you over the couple of years. Norman is incredibly curious. He's like a Media Lab graduate student. I mean, he just loves, exploring all these ideas. I find that amazing. We get a lot of really high-level people through the lab, presidents, CEOs. We had a king through here. But most high-level people, they don't listen very well. They actually just want to tell you what they think. And Norman really listens. I just love that. And he's always insightful and always has interesting things to say. And maybe more importantly, he's just fun to work with. So with that introduction, Norman, stage is yours.
Every year, I lead the Forum of Mayors from the United Nations in Geneva. And the idea is to encourage mayors from around the world, specifically the area of North America, Asia, and Europe, to share their experiences, to work together to learn from each other. And through that event last April, I was approached by the Mayor of Kharkiv for help. And that led to a Zoom call, our first meeting. And in anticipation of that, I had the thought that maybe it was the start of bringing together a group of the best minds around the world to anticipate an involvement in that city. I knew nothing about the city other than I might find out from a Google search. And so in anticipation of that, I brought for that first meeting with the mayor, the Zoom meeting, two economists who'd been part of a wider network in the foundation as mentors. Economists, Ed Glazer, Ian Goldin from Harvard University and Oxford, respectively, with a passionate interest in cities. Their writings before I had the privilege of meeting them were inspirational on the subject. And the mayor shared his vision for a master plan that would be about not just regeneration, not just building back the city as it was, but using it as an opportunity to improve the quality of the city. He specifically wanted me, as part of that venture, to be involved in a new building that would be about new technology, science-based. Perhaps it's much, much later after this first meeting that I discovered, in a way, how anticipatory his projection, his anticipation was. And in effect, it was creating the city of the future now. That was a great meeting. And at the end of the meeting, I picked up the phone and I phoned another individual who'd been hugely influential in the network of mentors for the foundation, workshops, bringing together young graduates. And that was Stuart Smith, who headed out Arabs in Berlin. I should perhaps explain for those who don't know that Ove Arup was somebody that I knew in the early years of my career, an inspirational figure who created a global enterprise of engineering with all the skills of transportation, sanitation, highways, traffic, and with the proximity of the Berlin office, and Stuart is a very, very sympathetic individual. And immediately I explained that we were doing this on a pro bono basis, that essentially our family was funding it. And I said, would you enter into this in the same spirit? Eventually, hopefully, still to happen, hopefully coming closer will be international funding. But meanwhile, Arabs have, without hesitation, contributed totally to that venture. This is just a glimpse of the foundation and that network, because the mentors, leading figures in their field, have been, as I will hopefully show in the short time available, very, very influential in terms of the potential for the regeneration of Kharkiv. There's always a danger if you bring together the best minds globally, that locally, quite reasonably, the populace, the individuals, the architects will say, it's about us, we're here, we're local. So again, one of the challenges is how you combine the best of global knowledge with a local awareness. And hopefully I'll be able to demonstrate that the way that this project has moved forward has been a fusion of those two influences, but predominantly it is bottom-up in its approach. There's a popular misconception, I guess, that means it's going to be somehow diluted. Nothing could be further from the truth. The reality is that good things happen when everybody buys into them. And just to condense some of the activities between April and October, as we are now, there have been 80 working sessions, 800 people, questionnaires, more than 16,000 people have responded to those questionnaires. And each of those questionnaires would have something like 30 very, very important questions about how the citizens would see the future of their city, right down to the most intimate details of how they see the future of their own home, how they'd like to improve it. Obviously, in this environment, a lot of that has been with Zoom exchanges. But there's also been the venue of the headquarters of the foundation in Madrid, bringing together the different parties. So here is one working session, and without reading the fine print, if you do, you'll see that the United Nations are there, foundation members, representatives of the council, representatives of the Kharkiv architects. So coming together face to face as well as more remotely. A word about Kharkiv. It's the second city in Ukraine. It's 1.5 million people. It's an extraordinary combination of industry, culture, learning, a multiplicity of universities, and it's very, very close to the Russian border. Historically, if you go back in time, the city center was generated by the confluence of two rivers. Going back to its 17th century roots, this point here was the fortress, the historic core, which persists as the central core. Before I knew about Kharkiv, through the late Rainer Banham, an extraordinary critic of modern architecture, he compared this with the Van Nelle industrial complex in Holland as one of the iconic works of the constructivist movement 1920s. And that was in the background here. You can see it at the end of the river there. So an extraordinary combination of heritage buildings. And also, just to quantify some of the recent tragedies ongoing, the damage or destruction of 6,000 homes, more than 200 schools, almost 100 hospitals, offices, cultural buildings. The list is endless. There's a confluence, there's a convergence of desires here. Advocacy that might come from those of us who are more remote, rebuilding the destroyed heritage, statement of the architects group, a transport report from the past to improve the quality of public spaces, and the mayor of Kharkiv, who later in that process identified the potential for a monument to the war. So moving into a time of victory, a building that would freeze for future generations the memories of the conflict and would be a public building. And he said the Reichstag that you were responsible for with your team and the politicians in Berlin, that could be a model for that. And as a reminder here, this is the reborn Reichstag, was created to bring together, to reunify East and West Berlin after the fall of the wall. And it has this very real public dimension, attracts millions of visitors every year, second most visited, big symbol of reunited Germany, as well as a symbol of Berlin. But important perhaps to remember that this was the very symbol of the conflict of World War II, and appropriately identified as the potential for a Ukrainian version of that in the future, the regional headquarters on Freedom Square. And Freedom Square being the historic center of Kharkiv. And those rivers, perhaps in a long-standing urban tradition, become the generators for mobility, for communication post the river. So it's hardly surprising that you can see the way in which that influences the pattern of the road network and the rail network, and finally the metro. And so as we move through, we have all these exchanges, we're analyzing, we're trying to find trends, we're trying to find how you can build on the existing pattern and improve that pattern. So in commuting, the questionnaires, the analysis shows an extraordinary dominance of public transport. The red is the metro, the yellow is the public transport, tram, buses, trolleybuses. Very, very little cycling, hardly anything in the way of cycling, a lot of walking, and only 20% of the car use. So an extraordinarily good start. And how do you build on that? So what you really want to do at this point is to look at how you use the existing network of metro, of public transport, which might determine the location of certain key elements still to be generated, the science element, for example. And my colleague from the foundation, Diego, will be homing in on that shortly. But obviously the imperative here to improve the quality of spaces for walking and biking. And the rivers really give the clue to that. And very fortunately, those rivers have an abundance of nature on their banks, and that gives the clue for, and again, this is coming from a groundswell of opinion encouraged by Arabs, the Kharkiv architects, the local architects, to transform the riverbanks into a new network of green and blue corridors for pedestrians, for biking, to create a citywide network. And as we seek to find patterns, to find synergies, then we start to explore the possibility of those rivers developing that network. And that leads us, not surprisingly, as you'll see, to the heritage of industry. Industry, like the example that I took earlier of Duisburg, was the very lifeblood of this city. But that comes with some very, very serious downsides. I mean, so much so that 20% of the area has been devoted to heavy industry and still has that imprint. But that industry is probably best mirrored in European terms by Airbus, not by your Boeing. the two giants of aviation. Boeing is autonomous, it's here in this country, is self-sufficient. Airbus is dependent on a network of European countries which produce individual components. Engines will come from one country, the wings will come from another country, the fuselage, so on and so forth, and they're all assembled. The real downside here is that Ukraine was part of the Soviet bloc, so Antonov did not make aircraft. It made critical elements of aircraft. And that's the story, not just of aviation, it's the story of heavy industry. There are some exceptions, fortunately, but that's the pattern. And that leads to the serious examination, which the mayor anticipated in terms of saying, you know, I see science at that very, very first meeting, the rebirth, the regeneration. But it's worth tracing that heritage because industry grew around the rivers. And then housing grew related to the industry. And at this point, I'm thinking because in that initial exchange with the mayor, more or less, I want you to re-examine the nature of industry. And I'd forgotten until recently putting together a monograph on our work. This is a drawing that I did, it must have been half a century ago, in the early 1970s at the request of a very influential magazine at that time, and a very influential figure, Cedric Price, Architectural Review, Industry of the Future. And you can see that there's a dominance of nature. And what I'm really saying at that point is that under one roof, in one building, you should have all the elements of leisure, of cafes, of galleries, of event spaces, heavy industry, light industry, not heavy industry, correction, light industry, but the servicing for that light industry. So in a way, that as a prototype, although it's single story and we'd be talking about a multi-story environment, is a model. Coming back to the questionnaires, are you satisfied with the quality of the house that you live in? As you can see, it's a very small proportion who in green are very satisfied or in blue satisfied. Are you satisfied with the neighborhood? A very high level of satisfaction. Everybody wants to go back to the neighborhood, but they have a lot of reservations about their home. So in the neighborhood, 2/3 are either satisfied or very satisfied. They believe that the quality of public space can improve, and hardly surprising, mindful of the nightmare that they're going through at the moment, they want bomb shelters in the future. And it's not that long ago that I can remember, and even the home that we live in has a nuclear fallout shelter. The Cold War is not that long ago. And bomb shelters were part of, in many countries, the code compliant. In other words, if you weren't providing it, you would not get the permission to build a building. So what was the ideal neighborhood? And this rather difficult to read kind of conglomeration of activities. The ideal neighborhood is one where you can walk from your home to the place of work, to a place to dine, a restaurant, easy walking distance of a school, of sports facilities, leisure facilities. And of course, as we heard earlier, that is one of the latest kind of results of the pandemic. The mayor of Paris, the advisors to the mayor, saying, as we all observed during the pandemic, the neighborhoods suddenly became vibrant and alive. Locals were coming together. So this idea of the 15-minute city where everything was within 15 minutes of walking distance. I think it's an oversimplification of the city because the city is the city because it not only has neighborhoods, but it has the cultural focus, the commercial focus, the buzz of the city center. So it's progressive, it's desirable, it's only one part of a larger picture. It's also an important reminder that some cities, this is not new. London, for example, more than 90% of the Londoners are within 15 minutes walking distance of a high street. And the high street contains many of these ingredients. So in a way, and I'll come at the end of this, and link the neighborhood back to master planning. But meanwhile, we look at the housing. The housing, the citizens, through this exchange of information, have said we're not happy with it. So if you look at it, 80% is Soviet-era prefabricated concrete multi-story housing. There's nothing wrong with concrete, there's nothing wrong with prefabrication, but it has serious shortfalls. It's the product of a particular point in time. And it's not common just to Ukraine or Kharkiv. You could find this in any city in the world. You could, particularly in France, outskirts of Paris, you'll find it in London. It was one of those global phenomena. There were variations locally, but it was a broad influence. As we go into it, the reality is quite different from that image. 75% are owning their own apartments in those buildings. Half of them want better insulation for sound or thermal, and only a quarter are satisfied. How do you address that? How do you bring, at this point, global experience to a positive influence locally? Through our foundation network, we became aware of the work of Anne Lacaton and her partner, Vassal. And they have pioneered the transformation of these kind of buildings in France. So the first kind of knee-jerk reaction of the authorities was we demolish these buildings and we build new buildings. This firm of architects demonstrated that you could actually take an obsolescent building, the people could live in it, they didn't even have to leave it, you could expand it, improve it whilst they were living in it, and it would be cheaper than knocking the building down and building a new building. So this building, after their transformation, looks like this. And if we kind of home in detail on that, that's the facade looking obliquely of the building in the first image. And what they did is they added another layer. Of course, they upgraded the infrastructure within the main building itself, but very, very delicately so that everybody could still live there. So that then has this additional layer. So that from the inside, this was how it was before, and this is how it is now. So the thought was, what if the city commissions this firm of architects to do a pilot project on a building, and that is an experiment which the local architects can participate in. It's like a workshop, it's like a school, so that, so empowered, they could then use their own professional expertise, use local materials, maybe create an industry for the materials that can transform the housing. So you would have new professional expertise and you would have a new industry. Because if I kind of go back to see that, you see that these are lightweight, industrialized materials, prefabricated. So there's a great potential there for industry and innovation. If we come to the energy issue, which is at the heart of climate change, then they're off to a great start. They've got more than half in nuclear, and they have a mixture of others. Unfortunately, they have a big red splodge, and that is coal. So, getting ahead of the game, can they plan for a future where they not only take out coal, but they take out the dependence on the centralized system? What do I mean by that? At the moment, you can hold a country to ransom by just blowing up its power plant, whatever the source of energy is, because it's centralized. And the grid is very vulnerable. 2.5 million Californians, as we know, were without electricity because the grid, the power lines, collapsed on top of trees, sparked fires, and everybody's running to buy autonomy in the form of diesel-driven generators. Not exactly good for the planet. So what, instead of the diesel-driven generator, you can create an industrial product. Now, it just so happens that this is a project. This is showing a nuclear battery, which was referred to earlier, a container's length 20 feet, which could generate 10 megawatts. Power a small community, a small town, or in the basement of one building in an entire Manhattan city block. And the Foundation's been working with Keynes, the Center for Advanced Nuclear Systems here, with Giacomo Bongiorno, who hopefully will be talking a little later and sharing from a real expert's insight the amazing potential for this as an industrial product. And here I cannot resist the temptation to try to separate prejudice, hysteria, and fantasy from the reality of mortality. And it's just worth looking at nuclear. If you take deaths per 1,000 terawatt hour, coal in China is 170,000 deaths. Coal average 100,000. Oil 36,000. Natural gas 4,000. Even PVs 440, down to 150 for wind. Nuclear almost disappears off the graph. It's 90, and that is taking every fatality from plants that were created at the birth of this energy generation, and by almost certainly are obsolete. So the potential for new generation. More people die in a day from coal inhalation than the entire Chernobyl accident. But we don't talk about it because we don't see it. And what is regarded as the ultimate downside is in actual fact the greatest advantage, and that is you have full control over the wastage from it, which is tiny, as opposed to the billions of tons of noxious gases which kill 10 million a year. That's another story. I'll move myself away from that. So what areas are we now looking at? The agriculture, the potential, as we've heard earlier, to industrialize that, to bring it into the city, urban farming, fresher food, more flavorful, more sustainable, liberating the countryside. In short, work in progress, very much about a process. Not surprisingly, perhaps unspoken, and a number of people have asked me, but how can you be working on a blueprint for the future when this city is under constant bombardment in the middle of a horrific war? And my answer to that is that as a child, I grew up in this. In 1943, I was probably 8 years old. I would wake up in the middle of the night in a bomb shelter. This kind of stuff was the essence, the horror of World War II. And it was in the height of World War II that the government instigated a blueprint, a master plan for the future of London, Greater London, and the nation beyond. It was called the Abercrombie Plan. This is an excerpt from it. And interestingly, just look at these little gloops. The idea was to bring forth the importance of the neighborhood. It was also about addressing all the issues which are familiar to us today: traffic congestion, improving housing, bringing back nature. And what are the lessons? I think there are a number of lessons. One of the lessons is that this was not a bureaucratic imposition. It didn't have the kind of consultation that we've been talking about on Kharkiv. But just like Zelensky and the mayor of Kharkiv, the leaders, the king and queen, lived throughout the Blitz. They didn't leave London. This was endorsed by them. You could buy it in every bookshop. It was 4 shillings. I've got a copy of it on my shelf in Martha's Vineyard. I look at it, even as an inspiration today. It went through all the schools. Everybody was immersed in this. This was not just something that would happen after the war, it was morally, it had an imperative, it had an encouragement for a belief in the future. What are the differences now from then? I think predominantly the principles are the same. They're enduring, they're timeless. But some of the differences, and the differences that bring the foundation together with the amazing work of the City Lab here, is the technology, the foresight, to be able to use tools to explore some of these ideas and to quantify their effects socially, environmentally, and economically. So that is really what brings us together here today. Thank you.